What if the most dangerous threat to Vladimir Putin is no longer coming from Ukraine, or from NATO, or from the battlefield at all? What if it is coming from the men who made him rich? Before we go further, if you want to understand how power really works inside Russia, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing the truth behind the headlines, and share this with one friend who thinks Putin's grip on power is unshakable. Now let's get into it. For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin ruled Russia with one simple rule. Only the state carries guns, not businessmen, not billionaires, not private companies, no matter how rich they became. This rule was not an accident. It was the foundation of his entire system. Putin allowed the oligarchs to keep their fortunes, their yachts, their mansions in London, and their seats at the table, but only on one condition. They stayed out of the security business. The military, the police, and the intelligence services belonged to the Kremlin, and only the Kremlin. That single arrangement kept Russia's richest men loyal, or at least obedient, for 25 years. That arrangement is now breaking apart. Quietly, without dramatic announcements, without press conferences, Russia's biggest state-linked companies are being handed something they were never supposed to have. Armed men, real weapons, real defensive units paid for by corporate money and built to protect corporate assets. This is not a rumor from an anonymous Telegram channel. This is coming from Russian media itself. Gazprom, one of the largest and most politically connected companies on Earth, has reached an agreement with Russia's Ministry of Defense to create its own mobile air defense units. On paper, these units are still officially part of the state. In reality, they are financed, equipped, and effectively controlled by the company they are protecting. Think about what that actually means. For the first time in Putin's Russia, a private commercial giant is building an armed force, loyal to its own interests, sitting right next to the world's largest nuclear arsenal. This is the story of why that is happening, why it terrifies people who understand how Russian power really works, and why it could end up being one of the most important cracks in Putin's control since he came to power. To understand why this is happening, we need to go back to the one thing Russia has completely failed to do since this war began. Protect its own territory. Russia is not a small country with a weak military. It has hundreds of advanced air defense systems. It has fighter jets. It has attack helicopters. It has one of the largest defense budgets on the planet. And yet, for years now, Ukrainian long-range drones have been slipping past all of it again and again, striking deep inside Russian territory. These are not small, symbolic attacks. Ukrainian drones have hit targets more than 2,500 kilometers from the border. They have struck oil refineries. They have struck fuel depots. They have struck pumping stations that keep Russia's entire energy export system running. Every single one of these strikes costs Russia money it desperately needs. Money that is already stretched thin by the war, by sanctions, and by a shrinking economy. Every burning refinery is not just a fire on the news. It is billions of rubles in lost production, lost exports, and expensive repairs that Russia can barely afford. So the Kremlin had a decision to make. It could admit that its air defense system is failing to protect the country's economic lifeline, or it could quietly shift the burden onto someone else. It chose the second option. Instead of fixing the problem at a national level, Russia decided to let its wealthiest companies build their own small armies to guard their own factories, refineries, and pipelines. This might sound familiar, because it is not even an original idea. Russia is copying a tactic that Ukraine developed out of necessity. Ukrainian forces built mobile air defense teams using ordinary pickup trucks fitted with machine guns, moving quickly from place to place to intercept incoming drones. It worked because Ukrainian soldiers had experience, coordination, and speed on their side. Russia looked at that success and tried to copy it, but copying a tactic is not the same as copying the skill behind it. Here is the uncomfortable truth for the Kremlin. These new mobile units are unlikely to solve anything. Ukrainian drones can fly at speeds close to 200 kilometers per hour. They are small, fast, and incredibly difficult to hit, even for trained military crews using proper radar and targeting systems. Now imagine trying to shoot these down with rushed, improvised units defending a corporation's refinery instead of a well-drilled military position. Russian footage already shows soldiers firing wildly into the sky, while drones calmly continue toward their targets. Some are intercepted. Many are not. The pattern is already clear, and it is not encouraging for Moscow. So why go through with this plan at all if it probably will not work? Because the Kremlin is not really solving a military problem anymore. It is trying to solve a political one. Russia's biggest companies are not just annoyed about drone strikes. They are losing enormous amounts of money because of them, and they are losing patience with a government that keeps promising protection it cannot deliver. Let's put some real numbers behind this, because numbers make the picture much clearer. Russia's energy sector is not just one part of its economy. It is the backbone of the entire war machine. Oil and gas revenue funds a huge share of the national budget, pays soldiers, buys weapons, and keeps the ruble from collapsing entirely under the weight of sanctions. When a refinery goes offline for weeks because of a drone strike, that is not a small local problem. That is a direct hit on the money that keeps the entire war effort running. Multiply that by dozens of strikes over the past 2 years, and you start to understand why Russian companies are so desperate that they are willing to fund their own private defense rather than simply wait for the Ministry of Defense to fix the problem. Even inside Russia's own business establishment, people are starting to say the quiet part out loud. Alexander Shokin, the head of Russia's Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, has openly admitted that businesses are not equipped or trained to carry out national air defense duties. That is a remarkable admission. It confirms something that should worry anyone watching this conflict closely. Protecting critical national infrastructure is supposed to be the job of the military. When a government starts asking private companies to take over that responsibility, it is not a sign of strength. It is a public confession of weakness. And this is where the real danger begins for Putin, a danger that has nothing to do with Ukraine at all. For the first time in decades, some of Russia's richest and most powerful men are being given something the Kremlin swore they would never have: loyal, armed personnel operating under their financial control. Yes, these units are technically still tied to the Ministry of Defense on paper, but paper does not decide loyalty. Money does. And the money paying these soldiers' salaries, buying their equipment, and keeping their operations running is coming directly from the corporations they protect. Once a company is paying for the guns, the ammunition, the vehicles, and the men holding them, that company gains real influence over those men, regardless of what any official document says. This is exactly how power shifted in empires throughout history. It rarely happens with a dramatic coup. It happens slowly, quietly, through arrangements that look reasonable and necessary at the time, until one day the people with the money also happen to be the people with the guns. Now pause for a moment and think about who these oligarchs actually are. These are not ordinary citizens simply trying to protect their property. These are men who already possess enormous personal wealth. They already have political connections that stretch across Russian ministries, courts, and regional governments. Many of them have relationships with foreign markets, foreign banks, and foreign business partners, relationships that have been badly damaged by the war and by international sanctions. Some of them have already lost billions of dollars because of wartime disruption, nationalization, and the constant threat of state seizure of their assets. These are men with deep grievances against the very government that is now arming their private security forces. Consider what these oligarchs have already lost. Some had international business empires stretching from London to Dubai. Empires now frozen, seized, or cut off entirely because of sanctions. Some had yachts confiscated in foreign ports. Some had bank accounts frozen overnight. Some watched foreign partners walk away from decades-old deals within days of the war starting. These are men who built their fortunes over 30 years, only to watch huge chunks of it disappear because of a war they did not start and cannot control. That kind of loss does not just create financial pain, it creates deep personal resentment toward the government that put them in this position in the first place. Add loyal armed men to that mix, and you no longer have simple businessmen. You have something closer to independent power centers, wealthy, connected, frustrated, and now, for the first time, armed. This is precisely the combination that has toppled leaders throughout history. Wealth alone is manageable. A government can tax it, regulate it, or seize it. Political connections alone are manageable too, since they can be reshuffled, threatened, or replaced. But wealth, connections, and loyal armed men, all held by the same small group of people at the same time, is a different story entirely. That combination is how empires have fractured for centuries, from the fall of Rome to the rise of feudal warlords, to the private armies that shaped revolutions long before anyone had ever heard the word Kremlin. Putin understands this history extremely well. It is likely one of the biggest reasons he built such a rigid system in the first place, one where the state alone controlled every weapon in the country. So why would he allow this shift to happen now, in the middle of a war, when his position should theoretically require even tighter control, not looser control? The uncomfortable answer is that he may not have much of a choice left. Russia's military is stretched thin across an enormous front line. Its air defense systems, despite their sheer numbers, are simply not able to protect every refinery, every pipeline, and every energy facility across a country that spans 11 time zones. Something had to give. And rather than admitting failure publicly, the Kremlin chose a quieter solution. Let the oligarchs pay for their own protection. Let them believe they are simply defending their own property. Frame it as cooperation between business and the state, rather than what it really looks like from the outside, a gradual transfer of coercive power away from the center. If you're starting to see how fragile this balance of power really is, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is only going to get more important from here. And if this video is opening your eyes to something you had not considered before, drop a like right now. It costs you nothing, but it tells this channel that people actually want deeper analysis like this instead of shallow headlines. There is also a quieter signal hiding inside this story, one that is easy to miss if you are not paying close attention. The fact that Russian state media reported this deal at all is strange. A government that wanted to hide a growing weakness would normally keep an arrangement like this buried in classified paperwork. Instead, it was announced almost casually as if it were simply smart, modern cooperation between business and defense. That kind of public framing suggests the Kremlin is trying to control the narrative before anyone else does, trying to make a sign of weakness look like a sign of innovation. Governments only do that when they are worried about how something will be perceived if left unexplained. Let's talk about what happens next, because this is where the real tension in this story lives. If these mobile air defense units actually worked, if they successfully stopped Ukrainian drone strikes and protected Russian refineries, the story might end here as a simple, if unusual, wartime adaptation. But the evidence so far suggests these units will not solve the underlying problem. Ukrainian drone technology keeps advancing. Ukrainian pilots keep gaining experience. Russian mobile units, by comparison, are new, rushed, and built on borrowed tactics rather than genuine expertise. So picture the most likely outcome. These new corporate-funded defense units continue to underperform. Refineries keep burning. Pipelines keep getting hit. Export revenue keeps shrinking. And the oligarchs funding all of this keep watching their money disappear month after month, strike after strike. At that point, frustration does not fade away. It grows. And this time, that frustration is not directed only at Ukraine or at the war in general. It becomes directed squarely at the Russian Ministry of Defense and, by extension, at the Kremlin itself for failing to protect the very assets that keep Russia's economy alive. Imagine being one of these business leaders. You're already losing money because of sanctions. You're already losing money because of the war. Now you're being asked to personally fund the defense of your own factories because the state cannot do the job it has always claimed exclusive responsibility for. And even after spending that money, the attacks continue anyway. That is not a recipe for gratitude toward the Kremlin. That is a recipe for resentment. Here is the deeper problem hiding underneath all of this. Once you allow oligarchs to build their own armed units, even for a narrow defensive purpose, you have already broken the psychological monopoly the state once held over organized force. It becomes much harder to reverse. Today, these units exist to shoot down drones over a refinery. But armed men, once organized, trained, and funded, do not simply vanish when their original justification changes. They remain an asset. They remain a resource. And in a system where political loyalty is constantly being tested, having your own trained personnel, rather than depending entirely on the state's goodwill, is an enormous shift in leverage. This changes the entire relationship between Putin and Russia's business elite. For years, Putin's power over the oligarchs rested partly on fear. If you crossed him, he could send state security forces to seize your company, arrest your associates, or worse. That threat only works if the oligarchs have no independent means of protecting themselves or pushing back. But once an oligarch has his own trained personnel connected through official contracts to the state itself, some of that fear naturally starts to fade. He is no longer entirely dependent on the Kremlin's mercy for his own protection. This does not mean these companies suddenly have the power to challenge Putin directly, at least not yet. But it does mean the foundation of his control is quietly shifting. Historically, the moment a ruler starts sharing armed force with the economic elite around him, even in a limited, controlled way, is rarely the moment things get safer for that ruler. It is usually the beginning of a slow erosion, one small compromise leading to another until the balance of power looks completely different from where it started. And there is another layer to this story that makes it even more significant. This is not actually the first time Putin's Russia has flirted with private armed forces answering to someone other than the state. The most famous example is the Wagner mercenary group, a private military organization that grew powerful enough to eventually challenge the Kremlin directly, marching toward Moscow in an armed mutiny that shocked the entire world. That situation ended in chaos, confusion, and the death of Wagner's own leader under mysterious circumstances. You would think that experience alone would make the Kremlin deeply cautious about ever again allowing armed groups to exist outside of direct state control. Yet here we are again, watching a new version of the same underlying pattern emerge, this time wrapped in corporate language instead of mercenary contracts. Different packaging, same fundamental risk. Armed men, loyal to someone other than the central government, operating with resources and independence that the state itself struggles to fully monitor. Quick pause here, because if this is the kind of story you actually want more of, tell me in the simplest way possible. Tap that like button. Not for me, but for the algorithm that decides whether videos like this reach more people who are tired of surface-level news. If you are new here, Subscribing takes 1 second and means you will not miss the next chapter of this story when it happens. And if you know someone who still thinks authoritarian systems are permanently stable, this is the video to send them. History has shown again and again that once you start down this road, it becomes extremely difficult to walk back. Systems built entirely around one person's control tend to be brittle, not flexible. They can look completely stable for years, right up until the moment several pressures combine at once: economic strain, military failure, and internal elite frustration. And then everything can shift with surprising speed. Right now, Russia is dealing with all three of these pressures simultaneously. The economy is under enormous strain from prolonged sanctions and years of costly warfare. The military is visibly struggling to protect even its own strategic infrastructure. And now, its most powerful business leaders are being handed the very tool, organized, armed personnel, that could eventually allow them to act independently of Moscow's direct control. It also helps to remember that Putin himself rose to power partly by taming Russia's oligarchs in the first place. Back in the early 2000s, men like Mikhail Khodorkovsky learned the hard way what happens when a businessman challenges the Kremlin directly. Arrest, imprisonment, and the seizure of an entire company sent a clear message to every other wealthy Russian. Stay in your lane, stay quiet, and stay loyal, and you will be allowed to keep your fortune. That message worked for 2 decades. It worked because the state held every gun in the country, and the oligarchs held none. This new arrangement chips away at exactly that foundation, the very thing that made Putin's original crackdown so effective in the first place. None of this means collapse is guaranteed, or that change will happen overnight. Authoritarian systems can survive an extraordinary amount of internal stress, often for far longer than outside observers expect. But what this story does show, clearly and unmistakably, is that the foundation underneath Putin's power is no longer as solid as it once was. The state's grip on organized force, the very thing that has kept Russia's oligarchs obedient for over 2 decades, is quietly loosening piece by piece, contract by contract. And once that grip starts to loosen, history rarely allows it to simply tighten back up on its own. It usually takes a moment of crisis to reveal exactly how much has already changed underneath the surface, often catching everyone, including the man at the very top, by surprise. There's one more angle worth thinking about, and it might be the most important one of all. Wars have a strange way of exposing exactly which parts of a system are strong and which parts were only ever held together by fear and silence. Before the war, nobody was publicly discussing whether Russian oligarchs might need their own armed protection. The idea would have sounded absurd. It is the war itself, and specifically Russia's inability to defend its own territory, that forced this conversation into the open. That tells you something important. This is not a change the Kremlin wanted. It is a change the Kremlin was forced into by circumstances it could not control, using tools it did not want to give away. Forced changes tend to be the most dangerous kind, precisely because they are not part of anyone's original plan. They happen under pressure, get normalized, quickly out of necessity, and then quietly become permanent long after the original emergency has passed. Think about how many wartime measures throughout history ended up outliving the wars that created them. Emergency powers rarely disappear once the emergency ends. Temporary arrangements have a habit of becoming permanent fixtures, especially when powerful people benefit from them. If Russia's oligarchs get used to having their own armed protection during this war, there is no reason to assume they will happily give it up once the war eventually ends. Once you have built something, funded something, and trained men to operate it, dismantling that structure requires someone to actively choose to give up power. History shows us that people rarely make that choice voluntarily. So here is the real question worth sitting with. Not whether Russia's oligarchs will openly rebel tomorrow, because they almost certainly will not, but whether Vladimir Putin, the man who built his entire 25-year rule on one unbroken rule, that only the state carries weapons, has just quietly broken his own most important promise to himself. And if he has, then the danger to his position may not come from a battlefield thousands of kilometers away. It may already be standing much closer to home, inside boardrooms, behind corporate budgets, and now, for the first time, behind rifles that answer to money as much as they answer to Moscow. Before we close this out, here's something worth doing right now, not later. Pause for 2 seconds and hit subscribe, because stories like this one develop quietly in small pieces, long before mainstream coverage catches up, and you do not want to miss the moment this quiet shift becomes an obvious one. Like this video, if you made it this far, it genuinely helps more people see this kind of analysis instead of shallow, recycled headlines. And if someone in your life still believes Putin's control over Russia is completely unshakable, send them this video, because what we just walked through says otherwise. Think back to where we started. A single agreement between a gas company and a defense ministry, quietly reported, quietly approved, and quietly normalized. On its own, it might look like nothing more than a practical wartime fix. But context changes everything. In a system built entirely on one man controlling every weapon in the country, even a small, seemingly practical exception can carry enormous weight. It is rarely the biggest, loudest events that end powerful systems. It is usually the small, quiet exceptions, made under pressure, that nobody thought to stop in time. Empires do not usually fall because an enemy at the gates finally breaks through. They fall because the walls were already cracking from the inside, long before anyone outside noticed. Right now, in Russia, some of those cracks are becoming visible for the very first time, not on a battlefield, but inside boardrooms, budget meetings, and quiet agreements between corporations, and a government that can no longer protect them the way it used to. Whether these cracks eventually widen into something that threatens Putin directly, or whether they remain small and contained for years to come, is impossible to predict with certainty. But one thing is now undeniable: the rule that defined Putin's Russia for a generation, the rule that kept his richest citizens loyal and unarmed, no longer fully holds. And once a rule like that breaks, even quietly, even just once, the man who depended on it can never be entirely certain it will hold the next time either.